Friends, we are reading Watson's Introduction to Sima Qian's History of China. Is variously pronounced as Suma Qian, Sima Qian. Wikipedia entry வந்து SIMA space QIAN spelling கொடுக்குது. Sima Qianoட History of China BC to 2nd century BCல எழுதப்பட்டது. ஓகே, அதோட இன்ட்ரொடக்ஷன் படிச்சுட்டு இருக்கோம். I think there's too much of noise from the other room. One second, I'll just shut the thing down and come. The Chinese knight is bound by no oaths of fealty or pressure of feudal society to serve one lord to the death. The first duty of the knight is to advance in life and to achieve the fame he seeks, to look out for his own interests and to seize his own opportunities. Li Su, a representative of the particular class known as itinerant strategists, Yu Shui, emphasizes in his speeches that the man who hopes to get ahead must be ever alert to the changes of the times and quick to turn them to his own advantage. Section 87. And as he and others of his class made clear, this meant abandoning loyalties that did not appear advantageous, leaving the side that was losing and attaching oneself to the winner. If a scholar or a knight found that his talents were not being recognized and used, that he was not getting ahead as he had hoped, it was time for him to look for a new employer. Faithfulness, honesty, sacrifice were due not to just any lord, but only to the successful lord, the lord who appreciated and used his men well. This period in Chinese history abounds in stories of men who died for their lords and their friends, but they did not give their lives because of any rigid code of feudal obligation, but for the much more personal reasons of friendship and gratitude to a fellow man. Let's see, somebody has sent a message or something. Okay. It's live one watching. Okay. It's live one watching. This ideal of friendship is of particular importance in Chinese literature and thought. The joy of friendship, of finding a man who can recognize and appreciate one's own good qualities and the deep depth of gratitude which is owed to such a friend are constant themes of the stories of this age. Soma Qian, in his biographical section, devotes great space to these tales, for the question of the loyalty of old friends was one which deeply stirred the emotions of the Han people. The second chapter of Lia Chuan sections relates the famous story of the loyalty of the statesman Quan Sheng to his old friend Pao Shu, who had been kind and understanding when Quan Sheng was still poor and unknown. It was father and mother who gave me life, declares Quan Shuang, but Pao Tzu who understood me. Section 62 upon 3. The question of the loyalty of old friends was, for obvious reasons, a vital one in these times of rapid rise and fall of personal fortunes. If I became rich and powerful, I will not forget you, was the promise that the rebel Shen Shi made to his friends when he was still a laborer in the fields. Section 48 upon 2. And the same promise was exchanged by three ladies of the late Qian, who later became highly favored at the Han court. She who becomes honored first shall not forget the others. Section 49 upon 7. Sometimes these promises were kept. Much of the success of Kaotsu, founder of the Han dynasty, has been attributed to the faithfulness with which he remembered the men who had helped him in the early days of his struggles for power. But as often, the promises were broken. Chapter 120 of the Shi Chi is devoted to the stories of two men who were rich and powerful, but who, when they fell from favor, were deserted by all their former friends. Suma Qian ends his narrative with the famous words of another man who met the same fate. When one is poor and the other rich, then the true attitude of friendship may be known. When one is high and the other low, then the true form of friendship is seen. It was this ideal of friendship, the difficult friendship of the unequal, which underlay the lord and retainer relationship of the late Chow and Han, and which gave to that relationship both its fickleness and its warmth. Page 23. If the aim of the knight was to discover a master who would appreciate and use him well, that of the lord was to attract to his court the best men of the time. The most important quality the lord must possess is the faculty of recognizing the abilities of his men. The history of this period is obsessed with the problem of how to judge men. Again and again, we read of the disasters of rulers who listened to the advice of the wrong kind of men and turned the right kind away. If a lord knew how to pick good men, to perceive ability in others regardless of humble origins or circumstance, and if he treated them with respect and kindness, he could inspire a fervent and very personal loyalty which transcended all other ties of blood and country. Suma Qian in Shi Chi 75 to 78 has recorded with care and affection the colorful stories of four feudal lords and their bands of retainers who exercised power in four of the feudal states at the end of the Chow. These men, the so called four heroes, particularly the Lord of Sinling, are the ideal types of the Lord who knows how to command the respect and loyalty of his followers, as their followers represent the ideal of the brave and crafty retainer. The whole superb and moving body of poetry, which centers about the figure of the statesman Shu Yuan, on the other hand, deals with the tragic fate of the truly loyal and virtuous minister who is misunderstood and rejected by a misguided lord. With this background, with this breakdown of the old rigid feudalism which we have described came a certain air of optimism. New opportunities were opened for men regardless of birth to make a place for themselves in the world on the basis of their own talents and ability. One of the principles that was naturally most often insisted upon by this new class of gentlemen retainers was that ability, not birth, distinguishes a man. This idea, the only hinted at in the Analects, became one of the basic tenets of Confucianism. The Lichi states, there is no such thing in the world as acquiring honorable position by birth. Sun Tzu is more explicit. Although a man be the descendant of kings and peers, of high ministers or officials, if he cannot adhere to property and right, sorry, if he cannot adhere to propriety and right, he should be made a commoner. And Tung Shung Tzu extends the principle to include even the emperor. If the Son of Heaven cannot serve the will of heaven, then he should be cast out and given the title of Duke. This was the idea which inspired the peasant Chen Shi to lead a revolt against the Qin, boldly declaring, kings and generals are made, not born. Section 48 upon 7. And Kao Tzu and his band of followers, by rising from the lowest ranks of society to become rulers of the empire, proved that there was no longer any such thing as a sure birthright to rule. But if one could rise rapidly by good luck and his own efforts, he could just as rapidly fall from power when his luck changed. The schools of strategists and political advisors, in particular, were constantly engaged in a bitter struggle with each other for the favor of the rulers. And if the side that won gained wealth and glory, the side that lost faced exile or death. As one retainer bitterly put it, if you are successful in your job, you become a high official. If you fail, you are boiled alive. That is the kind of business it is. Section 66 upon 22. Thus, if men were optimistic over the chances for rapid success, they were also saddened by the spectacle of the equal rapidity with which success could change to failure, honor to disgrace, and execution. Having destroyed the idea that birth entitled a man to high position, the new leaders of the late Chow and early Han society found that they could no longer assure to their posterity the fruits of their own struggles. The family that tries to be military leaders for 3 generations, advised one retainer at the end of Chow, will surely meet defeat. Section 73 upon 18. The men who chose a civil career found likewise that with the vagaries of the ruler's whims and the constant machinations of rival court cliques, they could never be sure when they might fall from favor. Sima Qian, who knew the inside story of the rivalries of court officials, writes, a gentleman, regardless of whether he is wise or worthless, if he enters the court, will face suspicion. Section 105 upon 62. This atmosphere of rivalry and suspicion, of dramatic rise and fall of fortunes, bred a feeling of profound doubt and despair that pervades the literature of the period. Page 25. With the decay of the old religious beliefs, men lost their faith in an essentially well ordered and benevolent universe. Like the Greeks of the Hellenic age, the Chinese came to see themselves more and more as the playthings of a blind and capricious fortune that might at any moment strike them down. As the Huainan Tzu writes, the city of Liang in one night sank beneath the waves and was turned into a lake. And the brave and strong, the sage and wise suffered the same fate as the weak, the cowardly, and the unworthy. When fire breaks out and the wind sweeps it across Wu Mountain, the tall poplars and the purple iris, together with the lowly sagebrush, perish in the flames. Section 2 bar 13a to b. The poems of Chu Yuan and his followers and of the early Han poets emphasize the capriciousness of human fortune and the pitiful shortness of human life. Some poets seek as a solution a renunciation of the world and its strifes, expounding the Taoist idea of a retreat into mystical quietude. Others only counsel men to think and make merry with their possessions while they still have the time and ability to enjoy them. Of one thing they are all certain, there is nothing constant in human life but the eternal cycle of growth and decay, nothing sure but the nearness of death. The story of the unification of China by the Qin and the revolutionary measures taken by the new dynasty the abolition of feudalism, the establishment of a strong central government, the standardization of the writing system, the completion of the Great Wall, the burning of the books is too famous to need retelling here. One point should be emphasized, however. The Qin was the Bt Noir of the Han people, the personification of tyranny, oppression, arrogance, and untimeliness. Although the Han rulers availed themselves of many of the advantages of the Qin's labors and quietly continued to follow many of its principles and practices, they publicly declared themselves undying opponents of all that the Qin stood for. They were the saviors of the nation from a reign of terror, the redeemers of the destiny of the Chow, which had been untimely severed. The Confucianists, in particular, who had suffered most under the Qing's attempts at thought control, outdid themselves in heaping abuse upon the ill fated dynasty, so that Sima Qian was obliged to remind his readers that behind the demonic fury of the first emperor of the Qin lay long centuries of astute and sometimes benevolent rule by the ancestors of the House of Qin. Page 26. The unification of the nation, the abolition of feudalism, the great shifts of population under the Qin, and the bitter wars and social upheaval that accompanied its downfall marked the final extinction of the old feudal aristocracy of the Chow. The world of the Han that followed was almost entirely a world of new men rising from a new class in society. Of the leaders of the new regime, one, Chang Liang, was descended from a ministerial family of one of the pre-Qin states, while a few others had been minor officials under the Qin. But the rest, including the couple who became emperor and empress of the new dynasty, were commoners of the humblest origins. Several farmers, a dog butcher, an undertaker, a silk dealer, a cart puller, men who had neither birth nor learning to recommend them, but who, by their vision, daring, and astute native intelligence, rose to be rulers of the world. This humble origin of the House of Han, for all we can tell, was something new and unprecedented in the history of China, and it must be constantly borne in mind if one is to understand the temperament of the new era. We have noted about the way in which Sima Qian characterized the good and bad qualities of the first three Chinese dynasties: the good faith of the Xia and its perversion, rusticity, the piety of the Shang and its perversion, superstition, and the refinement of the Chow with its perversion, hollow show. According to Sima Qian, when this cycle is completed, it must begin again. The Qin failed because it did not sweep away the hollow show of the decadent Chow, but only added to it its own harsh and exacting laws. But the Han wisely returned to the good faith of the Xia. What Sima Qian is referring to here, I believe, is the air of rude, hearty simplicity which characterized the early Han rulers and their administration. Coward Su and his followers had been commoners under the Qin, and they knew how the common people suffered by the Qin laws. Page 27. They were able, therefore, to do away with those laws which most offended people while retaining the good points of the Qin administrative system. They gave the nation 60 or 70 years of relative freedom from internal and external disorder and frugal, laissez-faire government, and the empire so recovered and prospered that by the time of Suma Qian's birth, the people were living in comparative ease and plenty, and the government treasuries were overflowing. But this negative type of government, modeled largely upon the Taoist ideal of non action, could not continue forever. There were many problems demanding more positive action, which the Han rulers sooner or later would have to face. One was the question of Han relations with foreign peoples, in particular with the Xiongnu tribes on the northern border. The Xiongnu posed a constant threat to the peace of the Chinese. In the early Han, they often made destructive raids into the empire, riding almost to the capital itself. In addition, they failed to give the proper acknowledgments of submission and fealty to the Han rulers that Chinese tradition demanded of barbarian nations. On the contrary, the Han found itself in a position of having to send tribute to the Seeing Nu in an effort to buy peace. So insensitive were these barbarians to the dignity of the Chinese court that the widower chieftain of the Seeing Nu dared to send a letter to Empress Lu after the death of her husband, Kawotsu, suggesting that since they both were old and lonely, they ought to get married. The empress was livid with rage at the suggestion, but powerless to do anything but send a polite note of refusal. A second problem was the growing power of the Han peers. Kawotsu, reviving the feudal system which the Qin abolished, granted fiefs both to his followers and to his relatives. The former were ill fated from the first. Men who had fought side by side with Kawotsu in his rise to power, it was hard for them to realize when Kawotsu became emperor that he was no longer a comrade in arms but their ruler. Some chafed at the division of spoils, some dreamed of turning the tables and replacing their old leader as monarch. Kawotsu was suspicious of these men and doubted their loyalty. Page 28. Empress Lu was even more distrustful. The doubt and fear of both sides deepened until seven of these new feudal lords, five kings, and two marquises had either revolted or fallen under suspicion of revolt. One by one, they were defeated, forced to commit suicide, or to flee to the territory of the Seeing No. By the time of Emperor Wen's reign, these peers, who were not of the reigning Liu family, the other name peers as they were called, had ceased to be of any political importance. But the peers of the Liu clan fared better. Some were degenerate and incompetent, but many of them ruled their territories wisely and well, so that their power and independence steadily grew. These men, it was soon realized, posed a constant threat to the authority of the central court. The third problem that faced the Han administration was the direct result of its own laxity. Because the oppression and harsh rule of the Qin had so angered the nation, the early Han rulers were careful by contrast to keep the penal laws simple and to interfere as little as possible in the life of the people. But though this policy had many beneficial effects, it also led to a considerable amount of disorder and gangsterism, particularly in the outlying provinces. As so often in later Chinese history, local bosses appeared in the countryside and set themselves up as virtual rulers of the territory, maintaining, in the manner of the old feudal lords, their own bands of retainers to enforce their will. In addition, powerful landowners and merchants, grown rich on the peace and prosperity of the nation, were constantly encroaching upon the lands and rights of the poor, forcing the small farmers into debt and servitude and seizing their fields to create great estates. The fourth problem, unlike those enumerated above, had to do not so much with the material life of the new dynasty as with its spirit. There was a feeling among the educated class that the House of Han was lacking in dignity. The early Han rulers and their aides were, as might be expected considering their humble origins, a rowdy lot. Kavatsu was famous for his crude and disrespectful manners, the best known illustration being the time he snatched the hat from the head of a Confucian scholar and urinated into it to demonstrate his opinion of the man, while he himself complained when he became emperor that his followers were spending all their time drinking and carousing about the palace and hacking up the pillars with their swords. Page 29. Empress Lu was renowned for her inhuman cruelty. Emperor Hui died of dissipation, and Emperor Qing, when he was still heir apparent, in a fit of anger hit his distant cousin, the Prince of Wu, over the head with a chessboard and killed him. Quite naturally, there was a feeling among the more sensitive scholars and gentlemen at court that something should be done to give the imperial house a more dignified and exemplary tone. It was also felt that the Han, which until now had carried over many of the institutions of the Qin, should make more explicit the fact that it was a new dynasty independent of preceding reigns. This individuality should be expressed, scholars believed, by the acts traditionally appropriate to a new dynasty, changing the month on which the year began, altering the color of court flags and vestments, selecting a new element of the traditional five to honor as the ruling element of the dynasty, and performing the great Feng and Shan sacrifices, symbolic of the divine election of the ruling house. All of these problems came under discussion in the reign of the fourth ruler, Emperor Wen. But when but Emperor Wen was an example of a type revered in Chinese and Japanese history, the do nothing ruler, who cares only for peace and economy, living in a modest palace, dressing his empress in homespun, and issuing repeated proclamations castigating himself for his errors and beseeching his subjects to show him his faults. Emperor Wen succeeded in giving peace and comparative ease to his people, and for this he has been praised by Pan Ku and later historians as the greatest of the Han rulers. But his esteem was bought at a price. He did almost nothing to solve any of the urgent problems which faced the central administration. He simply stalled them off. Emperor Qing, who followed, attempted more positive action. He took stern measures to put down the lawlessness in the provinces, achieving considerable success. He also attempted to curb the power of the peers, but his efforts here only inspired a revolt of seven of the most powerful feudal states, which, although it was quickly quelled, served dramatically to show how late the hour was. In 141 BC, 5 years after the birth of Sima Qian, there came to the throne a new ruler, Emperor Wu, who set about with ever increasing vigor and daring to cope with the problems that faced the empire. His policies were positive in the extreme, the exact opposite of the negative rule of his predecessors. His reign marks a new era in Han history. With him began many of the policies and institutions that characterize later dynasties. With him also died many of the ideals of the late Shao and early Han. Emperor Wu realized that something must be done about Han relations with the Xiongnu. His solution was first to set up a strong series of defenses along the northern borders, and later, not satisfied with this, to carry the warfare deep into the enemy territory. Although he never succeeded in conquering the elusive nomadic tribes, he did much to assert the power of the Han and ensure at least a measure of peace for his successors. In addition, he extended by warfare and exploration the borders of the empire into Korea and to the southeast, southwest, and west, bringing the Chinese empire for the first time into direct contact with the lands of Central Asia. He continued the efforts of Emperor Qing to break the power of the feudal lords. He compelled them to divide their territory among their heirs, sent spies and overseers to their courts, tripped them up on multitude of petty crimes, forced them into bankruptcy, or seized their lands outright. His success was remarkable, and his reign, the Han PS, ceased to be a threat to the central government. He also increased the number and efficiency of the provincial administrators, suppressed the bandits and local bosses, greatly increased the complexity and severity of the laws, and broke the power of the wealthy merchants who had grown fat on the laissez-faire rule of his predecessors. Finally, he gave himself with spectacular energy to the task of demonstrating to the world the dignity and glory of Han rule. He changed the calendar, altered the color of the vestments, selected the element earth as the patron element of the Han, and carried out the sacrifices of Feng and Shan. Page 31. He constructed splendid palaces, great towers, and vast imperial parks in the capital at Shangan that dazzled the eyes of the citizens and foreign envoys. He made frequent progresses back and forth across the nation, showing himself to his subjects and performing elaborate sacrifices to the gods and spirits on the way. Favoring Confucianism over the other schools of thought, he took steps to promote the study of the classics and to make Confucianism the official creed of the state. To many men of his day, it must have seemed that a golden age had arrived when the ancient rites and ceremonies described in the classics would again flourish. The virtue and blessing of the Chinese monarch would flow out over his people and beyond the borders to the unenlightened barbarians, and heaven would send down auspicious tokens of its favor. Vinod Kumar said hi. Thank you, Vinod. Vinod Kumar said hi. But a vigorous policy such as Emperor Wu pursued was bound to arouse the opposition of many groups in society. The men of the early Han well knew that if China was to be spared the twin curses of foreign invasion and internal strife, it must be united under a single rule. Yet they harbored a dread of the kind of ruthless totalitarianism that had marked the brief unification of the Qin. The benign reign of Emperor Wen had permitted ample scope for the exercise of individual freedom, but in doing so, it had dangerously weakened the power and unity of the state. Emperor Wu, on the other hand, in his desire to strengthen and expand the nation and gather all power into his own hands, showed a careless disregard for individual rights and liberty, all too reminiscent of the hated Qin. The principal problem engaging thinking men of the period, such as Sima Qian, was how and where a proper balance could be struck between these apparently contradictory desires for individual freedom and national welfare. The problem, which has plagued and continues to plague all political theorists everywhere, was more acute in their eyes because they witnessed within the decades of Emperor Wu's rule the dramatic shift from the imbalance of one extreme to that of the other. Page 32. The court poet Suma Xiangju, in a proclamation to the elders of the district of Shu, who were opposing a government plan to build a road through Shu out of China to the west, explained that the emperor was an extraordinary man who was doing every extraordinary things which would necessarily be misunderstood and feared by the people. That the common people did not welcome many of Emperor Wu's policies is plain, but they were by no means the only ones who complained. The Confucianists, interestingly enough, clashed with their imperial patron on a number of issues. First was the question of the wars against the Xiongnu. The Confucianists were in favor of spreading the blessings of Chinese culture to foreign lands and asserting the dignity of the throne. But the foreign wars and expansion proved to be disastrously expensive in men and money. The burden of taxation and military service upon the people became constantly heavier. Contact with tribes to the west opened up a brisk new trade, but while Chinese silk poured out of the country, all that came in return was jewels and exotic fruits, luxury goods destined for the enjoyment of the rich alone. Soon the Confucianists were crying for a policy of peace and isolationism to allow the nation to recover its economic health. Emperor Wu, in order to support the foreign wars and the increasing lavishness of imperial life, was forced to search for new sources of revenue. One expedient, continued from earlier times, was to grant commutation of punishments upon payment of heavy fines. Another was the sale of honorary ranks and titles at court. But these alone would not suffice, and the government decided to go into business. It took over the salt, iron, and other monopolies that had been in the hands of private businessmen or local feudal lords and began to speculate in grain futures and the transport of goods. In these and other actions, the government was actually following old legalist theories, and for the administration of these new enterprises, the emperor employed private businessmen who openly expounded legalist doctrine. The Confucianists were horrified at the reappearance of the hated philosophy of the Qian. They insisted that the government should concern itself with higher ideals than the pursuit of profit. They complained that the excessive government meddling in the economic life of the nation meant only inferior goods, maladministration, and oppression for the people. Page 33. The Confucianists had recommended that the emperor set up a system of examinations for the selection and promotion of government officials, the beginnings of the famous Chinese examination system. But though the emperor put the system into effect, he used it chiefly to fill the administration with weak willed, soft spoken flatterers. His sale of titles threw the aristocratic hierarchy into confusion. The complexity and severity of his penal laws made it all an official to do to stay out of jail. When we read that a court official was accused of the crime of dissent in the heart because of a slight curl of his lip when hearing of a new government policy, section 30 upon 31, we can appreciate how far Emperor Wu's administration had departed from the old Confucian ideal of outspoken counsel and criticism by court officials. Finally, the Confucians were dissatisfied with the way the emperor conducted religious affairs, particularly the Feng and Shan sacrifices. Emperor Wu, though he professed admiration for Confucianism, surrounded himself with a host of magicians and wonder workers who tried to summon for him the spirits of the dead or ensure him immortal life. In his execution of the Feng and Shan sacrifices, he dispensed with the confused and contradictory counsels of the Confucianists and made up his own ritual by which the great ceremony became not an act of worship and invocation of divine blessing by the leader of the people for the sake of the nation as a whole, but a personal and secret search on the part of the ruler alone for immortality. Sima Qian, upon whose history so much of our information of this period is based, was one of the bitterest opponents of the policies of Emperor Wu. An official who spent all his life at court in the service of the emperor, he knew the true situation as few men of his period did. It has often been said that he turned against the emperor and wrote his history as a scathing condemnation of the age because of his bitterness over the punishment of castration imposed upon him by the emperor when he had become too outspoken in his criticisms. Oh, Sima Qian was castrated. Goodness. It is true that this terrible punishment did much to deepen the bitterness and anger of the unfortunate man. But it was not the motive for his history, for he had begun work on that some time before his misfortune, nor was it the sole cause of his disapproval of Emperor Wu and his rule. Like the Confucianists, he opposed the foreign policy of the emperor and terrible toll it was taking of the nation's health. As an enlightened and rational man, he abhorred the gross superstitions that the magicians persuaded the emperor to accept. He opposed the government monopolies and speculations for the same reasons the Confucians did, because the pursuit of profit was not a fit concern of rulers, and because these activities brought suffering to the people. As an exponent of a laissez-faire economic policy, he objected to the legalist policies that were throwing the economy of the nation into disorder and ruining the merchant class. He was angered and saddened by the harsh penal laws that had brought fear and punishment to so many of the officials, including himself. It has also been suggested that Sima Qian was a Taoist who therefore opposed the Confucian emperor on doctrinal grounds. This old charge of Taoist sympathies has been greatly exaggerated and misunderstood. Sima Qian's father, Suma Tan, openly favored Taoism over the other schools of thought. But Sima Qian himself at no point makes any such clear declaration in favor of one particular doctrine. As one of the most learned men of his day, he was familiar with all schools of thought and their literature. No doubt, he saw some good in them all, but his greatest respect seems always to have been reserved for Confucius, the Confucian literature, and the Confucian doctrine at its best. It is true that he is bitterly critical of Kung Sun Hung, a Confucian scholar who became a high official at Emperor Wu's court. But this was not because Kung Sun Hung was a Confucianist, but because he was a flatterer to the emperor and an unusually stern and cruel administrator. Kung Sun Hung began his career at court by outspokenly opposing the wars against the Xiongnu, but when he saw which way the wind of imperial desire was blowing, he did a direct about face and supported the wars. It was for reasons of personality, not doctrine, that Suma Qian condemned Kung Sun Hung and his kind, who had become increasingly numerous at the court of the strong willed emperor. Page 35. But Suma Qian's disillusionment with his age went much deeper than questions of specific government policies. He was an historian with an extraordinary love and sympathy for the past, and he was keen enough to discern in the changes that took place during his lifetime the death of many of the ideals of the past that he most admired. He felt a nostalgia for the days of the late Shao and early Han, when men could rise by their own abilities and climb to the highest positions. He admired the rough and ready ways, the faithfulness and friendship of the lords and their bands of retainers, the outspoken frankness of old political advisers and theorists, the willingness of the great generals to share hardships equally with their troops. He was a hero worshipper who devoted much of his life to writing of the heroes of the past, while in his own day he saw the old freedoms, the old personal loyalties being stifled by an ever growing bureaucracy and a net of petty and exacting laws. His disillusionment with his own age and his nostalgia for the age that had ended appear in his history in countless wry and subtle ways. Oh goodness, my Google Playbooks app collapsed. Oh, it closed down. Sorry friends, mobile konja heat agudhu nanikaren. Because the mobile is heating up, it's closing. Vinod Kumar said hi. Vinod Kumar said hi. So where was I? Somewhere in page 35, I guess. Okay, let's close this video here and begin another one.